Mawunyo Gbogbo is here today. Mawunyo is a music and pop culture reporter here at the ABC, for Double J and for ABC News. Mawunyo comes from a family who migrated to Australia from Ghana when she was little. Her family are serious Christians, and that's been a big influence on her life. She grew up in the mining and dairy town of Muswellbrook in New South Wales, and she did her journalism degree in Bathurst at Charles Sturt University. And Mawunyo has lived and worked in New York for a magazine called The Source, which is known as the Bible of hip-hop, far out. All of these influences have pushed and pulled Mawunyo in different directions. Like many migrant kids, she was an overachiever. And along the way, Mawunyo fell apart a few times. Once on the New York subway. And she's had to put herself back together again. It has been a wild, wild ride. Mawunyo has written a brilliantly honest and compelling memoir around her two abiding loves, and it's called Hip Hop and Hymns. Hi, Mawunyo.
Hi, Richard.
You made me feel so old reading your book. I thought it brought out the dad in me. I was going, where do you think you're going creeping out at night like that young lady? What are those boys you're hanging around with like? Am I overreacting here, do you think? Am I overdoing it a bit here?
I don't think you're overreacting. Okay. I was hiding in plain sight, really, getting away with stuff I shouldn't have been getting away with.
We have to start with your mum and dad. Both parents are from Ghana, as you are as well. Your mum's background, she's quite upper class, isn't she? I don't know what you call it, the class system or the way it works in Ghana socially.
So she was born into royalty, really.
Royalty?
So, yes. So Ghanaian royalty. So her grandfather and great-grandfather on her mother's side, they were chiefs. So basically in Ghana, that makes you royal. And so she was definitely in a high class.
You never got to meet your grandfather on her side because he died when your mum was pretty young. What story did your mum tell you about the day your grandfather died in Ghana?
It was a really sad day for my mother. So she had got up early in the morning, she was getting ready for school, and her father said to her, I don't want you to go to school today. And she sort of said to him, oh, why, Papa? Why? And he said he had been quite sick for a little while. And he said to her, when you come back, if you go to school today, you will come and see me at Hood Tea. And
what is that?
That is where Mum was born. It's also a town, a little village where the family cemetery was. And so Mum was devastated. She said, but she didn't quite believe it. She knew about death at that stage. She knew what death was. But she said, we get our exam results back today. I want to know how I went. She didn't honestly think her father would die that day. And so she went to school, and on her way back to the house, she ran into her brother and a cousin, and she was saying to them, where are you going? And she suddenly had that thought in her head, oh no, Papa's dead. Papa's dead. And she voiced that. And her brother was saying, yes, but don't tell anybody yet. He's a very important man. We're on our way to make preparations for his funeral. And Mum, obviously, she was absolutely devastated. She ran back to the house. She actually saw her father's lifeless body tucked into bed when she got into her home. And she was screaming and carrying on. And one of the people there actually said to her, you're very naughty. Your dad said don't go to school today and you went. We will put you in the same coffin as him and bury you too if you don't stop crying now.
Wow, that must have been devastating for her.
Absolutely devastating. So she took the death very, very hard. So she wrote on her wall, my father died, and she wrote the date and the month, and she wrote the afternoon, but she wrote it in Ewe, her native tongue, because she wasn't sure how to spell afternoon in English. But she wrote on her wall because she didn't own a diary. That was something that really, really affected her.
How important is faith to your mum?
Very, very important. So Mum has been a Christian for as long as I can remember. When she was in Ghana, there was a time when her father, who I just spoke about, was basically also believed in God, but he wasn't necessarily a Christian. So he would pray to the big God in heaven as well as the little gods in the form of statues on his property. And Mum, as she grew up, really accepted God as her personal saviour. And there was an incident where she ran into a white man when she was out looking for work in the capital, Accra. And this white man asked her if she wanted a lift. And she was like, yeah, okay. So he gave her a lift to where she was going. But for some reason, he decided to stop at his house. And so Mum was sort of looking at this guy, being quite strange and sort of didn't know what was going on. But she realised later on he was masturbating. And so the thing that happened, though, was he gave her 10 shillings before they parted ways. And Mum used those 10 shillings to buy a Bible. There was nothing else she wanted more, Richard.
The ways to the faith are strange and winding indeed, aren't they, under those circumstances? So she kind of made a holy thing out of a very squalid little incident then. How quickly does she put God into a sentence? How easily does God slip into a conversation?
Oh, my
with
goodness. You cannot talk to my mother without hearing the word God in a sentence. I mean, she will definitely mention God every chance she gets. She's very faithful. She will even rebuke the devil when she's speaking. I mean, there is no sentence out of my mother's mouth, no full sentence, without acknowledging and referencing God in some way.
How did she meet your dad?
So Mum and Dad met through a friend, but they were just friends to begin with at that time. But then Dad went away to Germany to study in the engineering field. So he worked as a technical officer for some time, but he went to Germany to do some practical training attachments. And Mum and Dad exchanged a lot of letters during that time. So they wrote to each other and their relationship blossomed through the letters, really.
So as your mum was studying to be a nurse and he was working in the engineering field, your dad chose to migrate to Australia. What attracted him to Australia, I wonder? That's a pretty interesting choice.
So he has a lot of friends in Ghana, and one of his friends was really wanting to migrate somewhere. He wanted to go somewhere, anywhere. He just wanted a bit of an adventure. Dad had already been to Germany, via the UK, so he wasn't as keen to leave Ghana, but his friend really, really wanted to go. So his friend said to him, we should apply to go to Papua New Guinea. There are black people there, we'll fit in. But PNG doesn't take migrants, and they were told that. But someone had said to them, why not try Australia?
There are black people in Australia too.
There are black people in Australia too. And so they did try Australia, and this was when Malcolm Fraser's government was in power, and he was very pro-immigration. And so they applied, they were accepted, and they came over here.
So then your dad got a job in Australia at the Bayswater Power Station in the Hunter region, and the whole family picked up sticks from Sydney and moved to Muswellbrook. Wow. What do you remember arriving in Muswellbrook and what it was like to actually pull into that country town as a kid with your family?
I remember what Mum and Dad told me about arriving. So basically we actually drove straight through the town because it's so small. And Dad only realised he'd missed the town when he saw a sign in the rearview mirror saying, thank you for visiting Muswellbrook. And so he turned back around, came into the main street.
Right.
And Mum was looking out the window and saw a woman smoking a cigarette, which was very different to the culture in Ghana. And she sort of looked over and said, oh, my goodness, that beautiful young lady is a prostitute. And Dad said, no, she's not a prostitute. People smoke cigarettes on street corners all the time here in Australia.
So once you'd settled into the area, you started going to church. What was it like going to church in Muswellbrook in those days?
I loved it. I love hymns. So I really, really connected with the hymns in church, the singing, So I was singing along to things like Blessed Assurance, which the lyrics are, this is my story, this is my song, praising my Saviour all the day long. That was little me with my little hymnal.
How great thou art. You're doing that as well?
How great thou art. Absolutely.
Right.
All the classic hymns, I was singing along to them and loving them. And I enjoyed church. Sometimes I would fall asleep, depending on the sermon, but it really was something that I connected with.
Tell me what happened when you found out as a little kid from your friend how babies are made.
Yeah, so another way that I listened to music was through secular music, so through Rage and video hits. But back then it was Rage mostly. So I was watching Rage with my friend and she was dancing around, we were having a great time. And then she stopped and suddenly said, "Your parents must have had sex." In fact, they must have done it 3 times. 1 time each for you, your brother, and your sister. I'm like, "What's sex?" And she said, "Sex." She told me what sex was.
Right.
And
that was just outlandish and couldn't possibly be true, could it?
I was like, no, Mum and Dad wouldn't have had sex. There's no way they would have had sex. She said, they did. And so I ran home to my mother. I said, "Mum, did you and Dad have sex?"
What did she say?
She paused. She looked at me, quite alarmed. "No." And then my youngest brother was born in Muswellbrook, so immaculate conception there.
There wouldn't have been a lot of African-born families in Muswellbrook in those days. I'm guessing yours was the only one in Muswellbrook in those days. I don't know. Did you feel that? Were you made to feel that way, that you were different from everyone else?
I did feel the difference. Yeah. So Muswellbrook, after a while, it was like I was part of the furniture. Part of the fabric. Our family were very much Muswellbrookny, and I just made up that name.
Yep.
But I really did notice that I had different interests to a lot of my friends. So they were into different types of music, for example. I was really into my hip hop because I could really relate to the artists that I saw on the television in these videos on Rage. And I also really liked movies like Poetic Justice, where I saw people who looked like me reflected back at me. So I did definitely notice a difference.
In school, you wrote you were forced to sit next to a boy who pretty much as soon as you sat down started throwing these vile racist taunts at you. Could you talk about that with your teacher? Could you complain about that?
I tried to tell my teacher that I didn't want to sit next to this kid anymore.
Did you say why?
I wouldn't say why, and I still don't quite understand why I chose not to say that. And the only way because I'm an overthinker, so I really do overthink things, and I reckon back then I would have thought, the teasing will get worse if I tell him what's happening and it's not going to go away.
So you wanted to detach yourself from him in a way that wouldn't necessarily incriminate him. Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah, I just wanted to move seats. And my teacher said, no, those seating arrangements will stay that way until the end of term. And then he said, "Why do you want to move?" And to me, he had already made up his mind. But had I have said, the guy you've got me sitting next to is a racist little bastard, he might have let me move. But to my young mind, I was stuck in this situation.
Did he make you feel ashamed in any way, or did you see something broken in him?
It's interesting because reflecting back, I definitely see something broken in him, absolutely. But at the time, I also had a lot of influences, positive influences that I was watching on television, people who looked like me, who were beautiful, intelligent, successful. I was watching shows like The Cosby Show at the time, and that was a big influence on me growing up. And so when he was telling me that I was stupid, I wasn't the N-word, all these sorts of things, I sort of had that in the back of my mind thinking, well, no, I'm like Carl Lewis, who can run 100 metres in a very quick amount of time. I am an amazing human being, really, because look at all the people that look like me who are also amazing.
And you wanted to be like Trish Goddard on the telly. Is she your inspiration for wanting to become a journalist?
Well, it's interesting because at first I only ever thought that she had great hair. And I remember asking my mum, why does her hair look like that and why do I have an afro texture? And Mum said, she's wearing a wiglet. I said,
wiglet?
A wiglet. I said, what's a wiglet? I want a wiglet. But my teacher at school made me realise that I could aspire to having more than just a wiglet, because she said to me, "Are you going to be like Trisha Goddard one day?" And I'm thinking, oh, what does she mean? She said, well, Trisha's on the 7:30 report. She is a journalist. You could be like her too. And I thought about it and really liked the idea. I thought, yeah, I'd like her hair, but I could have her career as well. So it was definitely an inspiration for me.
So at the same time, you're right, you met this guy, Tice. You called Tice, who who you just kind of was crazy about. He was kind of the first guy you kissed. What did you? He was kind of like the bad boy of the class. What did you like about him? Was it the bad boyness, or was it something else? Or was it because he was beautiful, or what?
I liked everything about Tice, everything. So Tice is incredibly good looking. He is very, very funny. I'm talking hilarious funny. So he'll find a joke in just about everything. So he would make me laugh. He made me laugh a lot. So he was hilarious. He was very intelligent. We were in school together and he would answer questions and I would think, how on earth do you know that? And this would be in every subject. So English, science, maths. He just knew the answers. But he used to play up a lot. And yes, he was, considered a bit of a bad boy, But I liked that about him as well because he was very cool, like the music I was listening to, like the artists I was listening to.
Inevitably, you started, going out and having fun the way you do when you're a teenager, when you're 17 and 18. Tell me about the night you disobeyed your mum and you went out to your friend's 18th birthday party.
So my friend had been planning her 18th birthday party for a long time. Every time I saw her, she would talk about this 18th birthday party. She went to Muswellbrook High, which is where I went to up until the end of year 10. And then I went to St Joseph's in Aberdeen. So I didn't get to see her a lot. She had just turned 18. I really wanted to go to this party. But I had been to another party the night before and Mum was saying, no, I don't want you to go to this party. And I couldn't understand why, because I'd done my homework, I'd cleaned my room. I thought, I'm going to go to this party. My friend wants me there. I've been talking to her about it for almost a year. She's been saying, I'm turning 18 next year. I'm going to have this party. And so I went to the party. It was a bore on arrival. I was really quite bored. And I thought after about half an hour or so, I got her mum to drop me off at home. It was about 8:30. I walked in. It was a very, calm domestic situation. Everyone was watching TV. Mum had fallen asleep, I think, in the study. And eventually I went to bed as well. And then Mum came into my room later on that night and said, basically, you've disobeyed me. I want you to go. And I sort of didn't really believe her at the time that she wanted to kick me out because, I had done things in the past, like smoking in my bedroom and had been in trouble about that. And so I kind of just stayed put. And then she comes in a bit later and said, no, I really want you out. And so
like right now in the middle of the night?
Right now in the middle of the night. And so I got up, I had a little bag that I picked up, didn't really put anything in it because I didn't really know where I was going or what I was doing. But then I got halfway down our street and I thought, I don't have my little pocket Bible. Mum has this thing about taking the little Bible with you everywhere you go, Make sure you take your little Bible. So I thought that was sufficient enough reason for me to go back to the house to get my Bible. So I went in and then she said, give me the key. So I gave her the key and I thought, wow, she really doesn't want me here. So I caught the train to Newcastle in the morning. And
so you wandered around the streets of Muswellbrook for hours, did you?
Yeah, there were so many people out. People were skating up to me on skateboards and all sorts of things. And
what, at 4 a.m?
Yeah, this is Muswellbrook at 4 a.m. that night. It was quite interesting. There was one guy in particular who skated up to me. I said, oh, yeah, Mum's just thrown me out, not sure where I'm going, but, off to the train station, waited for the train because there's basically, at the time, there was one train that would go to Newcastle each day in the morning. And
so what did you do when you got into Newcastle?
I just went and did a bit of shopping. It was funny because there was one of those Christian spooker types who handed me a leaflet saying going home at the time. And then I just did a little bit of window shopping, listened to a bit of music.
And where did you sleep that night?
I slept at Newcastle University in the games room. So I knew my way around because Mum was studying to be a registered nurse. She was an enrolled nurse at the time. And so she had spent a lot of time at Newcastle Uni and I had been there as well. And so I slept in one of the games rooms there.
And did you go home the next day?
I didn't. I thought that Mum might still be a bit upset. So I waited a little while to see if she would show up at Newcastle Uni so that I could beg for her forgiveness. She didn't show up. When I did go home, she was mortified that I'd been missing. I think it was for 42 hours. She said, "You were gone for 42 hours." She had reported me to the police that I'd been missing. She was absolutely so sad, and she was just, I've never seen my mother so devoid of strength.
You said you were in this kind of off and on relationship with Tice at the time and there were other boyfriends, but after a while you just decided it was better for you to switch off your feelings. Why did you think you needed to do that?
At the time, I was listening to a lot of hip-hop, so there was a lot of messages ingrained in the type of hip-hop I was listening to. So I was listening to things that were quite misogynistic, and at the same time, my life felt like it reflected that. Tice, although I was madly in love with him and he was madly in love with me, I'd find out later on, but didn't know at the time because he didn't express his feelings. And so to me, I was feeling like I wasn't loved. And so I decided I was going to switch off my feelings, switch off my romantic feelings, because I'd been hurt a couple of times really badly and felt that I just didn't want to be hurt like that again. You might hear about men who are capable of having sex without any feelings involved, and I felt like I should be like one of those men.
This is Conversations with Richard Fidler. To find out more, just head to abc.net.au/conversations.
Mawunyo, you went to Charles Sturt University and did journalism there, and you were organising these big hip-hop nights there, and hip-hop is a big thing for you in this book. What was it that do you think you loved about hip-hop? I'm sure there's a great many things, but what really drew you in and got you kind of addicted to hip-hop, if that's the right word?
I love everything about hip-hop. It's the sound. So to me, the most important elements of a song are the melody, the beats, how it sounds. And a lot of hip-hop just sounds really, really good, Richard.
Yeah, but it frocks up pretty well in the film clips too, doesn't it? Like, there's this huge element of fantasy in so many hip-hop film clips, like, artists like Little Kim that I know you're a big fan of. Is that part of the appeal as well?
Yeah, I think so, but also the lyrics as well. So, there's such a huge span when it comes to lyrics, when it comes to hip-hop. But I was listening to more of the gritty stuff. So to me, it was real. It was authentic and it was really raw. And I really enjoyed that about hip-hop. I still love hip-hop. I still listen to hip-hop today.
At the end of your journalism degree, you went to the United States, to upstate New York to begin with, to go to a college there for a while. How did that feel to be in a place like that as a person of African ancestry, but with an Australian accent? Was it hard for Americans to process that? Well,
every time I met particularly African Americans, they would say, "Where are you from?" once they heard my accent, because they assumed that I was American when they saw me. And then it would be suddenly, "Oh, where are you from? England?" And I'd say, "No, Australia. There are black people in Australia." And then I would sort of giggle and just play up my Australianness and have a bit of fun with them.
You did grow up in a dairy town where there are kangas in the main street quite a lot, didn't you? That's pretty Australian, yeah.
Very Australian. So basically, I think I was really well received in America, actually, because people felt like I was just one of them. It wasn't until I opened my mouth that they realised that there was a bit of a difference, and that difference was also embraced.
Then you went to New York City to work as an intern at The Source. Now, this is a big deal. I mean, working at The Source, like I said, it was known as the Bible of hip-hop in the United States. And you went to stay with some relatives who were living in an apartment in the Bronx. How did a nice girl from Muswellbrook like you react to living in the Bronx?
I loved the Bronx. I actually really, really wanted to be in the Bronx because it's the birthplace of rap music. I really wanted to be there. I really wanted to meet my relatives. I mean, the Bronx to me, I had my hairdresser right there at my doorstep. I had a gospel church right there on my doorstep.
All those places and songs by the Sugar Hill Gang, that's right there. You can see those locations.
Everything was right there. Right. I mean, New York was amazing, but the Bronx, being in the Bronx, it was just an exciting borough. It was everything I could have ever imagined, plus more.
So you now realise living and working and going to work in this amazing magazine, which is a really exciting thing, working for a guy like P. Frank Williams, who was one of your kind of journalistic heroes, I suppose, music journalistic heroes. It's really, really, really very exciting. But you're right that you were kind of a little back-footed in a way when you realised you're not African-American. You're kind of African-African or African-Australian. Tell me how you thought about that at the time, how those thoughts were playing around in your head.
So at the time, it was interesting because growing up in Muswellbrook and looking to African Americans as, the pinnacle of success, they were on my TV screens, they were on the radio, I was listening to them on the radio. And so to me, that was the pinnacle of blackness, really. And so I grew up thinking that I had the same history or very similar history to African Americans because I looked just like them. So I thought we were separated just by geography. And then in high school, when I find out that African Americans don't know where in Africa they're from, I was thinking, oh, really? I mean, I know I'm from Ghana, but they don't know where in Africa they're from. I'm different even from the same. I was already different in Muswellbrook. And now suddenly I'm different from these people who I looked up to so much. And so when I was in America, it was that feeling where I wanted to be accepted and that sort of thing. And I mean, they accepted me anyway, but I felt like I needed to hide my Africanness in some ways because I didn't want to not feel like I was one of them. And that really, I look back on that now and it's a real shame, because at the moment I'm very proud of being African. Being African is very cool. It's very cool. Afrobeats is a massive music genre that, is taking over the world, for example. There are so many Africans who've done amazing things on the world stage. But at the time I was thinking, well, I had a bit of an identity crisis in a way. And it's a shame. I should have been proud of who I was, but I really wasn't.
Before I get to this next bit, I think we should sort of just take a moment, though, to have you kind of relish the position you found yourself in, which was pretty amazing at that time.
It was
Did it feel like it? Did you feel like it was amazing to be working in New York City for this hip-hop magazine as a young journalist?
Absolutely. It was the pinnacle of anybody's career, really. It was incredible. I mean, I was working for the Bible of hip-hop. I was a big hip-hop fan. I used to read The Source magazine back in Muswellbrook. This was a huge, huge deal to be working for The Source magazine. And I was just an intern, but I was doing things that, staff were doing because I was being in the PR department and the boss of PR only had one intern. That was me. And so she gave me a lot of autonomy. She let me do so many things that other interns weren't doing. So other interns were stuffing envelopes and doing coffee runs because they were in the editorial section, so the more journalistic side of things. And I did my minor in PR at uni. And so P. Frank Williams, who you mentioned earlier, got me a position working with the PR guru. And so I got to help organise a press conference. I got to write a press release. I really got to be hands-on.
And meet all these famous faces and these musicians who you've been following.
Yeah, I was in the same room as people like LL Cool J, for example. I mean, it was amazing.
Then you had this kind of bad night in New York City And that sort of led to a breakdown. What can you tell me about that breakdown and how quickly you kind of slid down that slide?
Yeah, so when you're working for the Bible of hip hop, there are a few parties on every now and then, Richard. So every night of the week there was a party, basically. And so I would go to some of them. This particular night I went to a party, an industry party. I had a little bit too much to drink, a little bit of other stuff as well. And so I ended up at the subway station on my way home, and I'm thinking about all the things that have happened previously that have upset me. And I'm on the platform, crying and carrying on. And then the police show up, female, black, intoxicated. I could hear them saying in their little speakers. And I don't know what their plans were for me, but I can assume that I was headed to the cop shop. But I blacked out in the back of their paddy wagon, which is so fortunate. The fact that I blacked out meant they took me to the hospital instead. They took me to a hospital in the Bronx. And I woke up the next morning, went to work. My boss was surprised to see me there because she had seen me at the party the previous night. She was thinking, oh, wow, you're in all one piece and, you look great sort of thing. But then I had said something which I didn't intend to be sarcastic, but she thought that what I'd said was sarcastic. I know that my intentions weren't sarcasm at all. But she said, oh, you're so sarcastic and, I don't think you should be working here anymore sort of thing. And so I went home, and my uncle, who had noticed I didn't come home the previous night, was sort of like, well, where were you? What were you doing? And I said, I was at the hospital. And he said, why were you at the hospital? I left out the part that I was really, really drunk and legless because I was the gospel church going niece. I just told him that I was sick and I was taken to hospital. He said, I don't understand how a reasonable young woman, could suddenly just collapse and be taken to hospital. And I said, okay, I'll call the hospital and you can ask them if I was there last night, and I'm sure they'll tell you I was. And so I called the hospital. They confirmed I was there. Then he started asking them why I was there. I grabbed the phone and put it on the receiver, and he was really angry. He kicked me out of the apartment. And I'm in the middle of New York, 24-hour plane ride away from home. I've been kicked out. The once-in-a-lifetime opportunity at the source looks like it's ended as well. And so I'm in a really, really bad place. And
well, this has kind of happened in 24 hours too, hasn't it? You've blacked out on the subway. You've ended up in hospital. You've lost your job seemingly and been kicked out of the apartment. That's kind of terrifying.
It is terrifying for a 21-year-old. Yeah. So I was 21 at the time. It was a lot, basically. And so it's funny because as I was leaving New York, because my parents had changed my flight so that I could come back earlier, as I was leaving, I stopped off at the source offices because basically I still had the key to the room I was using. The boss there had asked me to come back, and I'd been back for a very short period of time. I don't even remember that period of time because I was so out of it. But I walked into P. Frank Williams's office and I was just not myself. I was just blaming myself for like the world falling apart, basically, blaming myself for things that I hadn't actually done.
You said at this point, you reached a point where you felt you had no longer had control for what you were saying or doing. Things were coming out of your mouth that you went, I don't know why I've said that. I don't even recognise that thought. That's really frightening, that moment.
It's very, very frightening. It really is. And when I returned to Australia, that really came to a head. Like I really experienced a breakdown where I was doing and saying things that I didn't really understand why I was doing and saying these things. And I was so confused. I was getting lost looking for my hotel room because at that stage, I thought I needed to do another internship in order to finish my degree because I hadn't quite finished my internship at the source. But it turned out I didn't really need to because I'd done so much work experience already. But I got a job at the Goodwill Games and I was a runner. So it was my job to run around and make sure that everything ran smoothly.
For Channel 9, yeah.
Well, I was employed by Turner Sports, but Channel 9 were...
With the broadcast partners, yeah.
Exactly. So I was running around, getting lost, trying to find my hotel room. I was
not able to actually buy anything from a supermarket that you were required.
I was so lost in the supermarket. So I'd look at the shelves and I couldn't recognize the items, and I'd go up and down the aisles looking for things, and I, lost the car in the car park, which happens to a lot of people, but this was serious. Like, I was looking for a long time to find this car, and then I crashed the car and didn't tell my boss, and it was just all these things that if I was myself, I wouldn't have been doing.
The doctor, you were eventually admitted to a psychiatric ward in a hospital, and the doctors diagnosed you with drug-induced psychosis.
Now, I was really shocked by that diagnosis because I hadn't taken any drugs. And it wasn't until years later that I realised, it was the diet pills I bought in New York, which had pseudoephedrine in them.
And were you just popping those like mad, were you?
Yeah.
And can you just buy that stuff over the counter in America?
Absolutely. You walk into a shop, you buy your diet pills, and away you go.
So you were getting kind of jacked up on pseudoephedrine, and without even really being conscious of that, just thinking, I'm just young and I've got a lot of stamina, and so that you have this car crash in your head as a result of that.
Yeah, I mean, there was also caffeine, really high amounts of caffeine in the pills as well. So I was really on a high, I was all over the place, and they resulted in this diagnosis, basically.
What came out of that when you felt better, and what was different for you?
So I really wanted to change my life around. I wanted to actually live like a Christian instead of just talking about being a Christian. At the time, I decided I wasn't going to drink ever again, and that lasted for 13 years. I did not have a drink. I wouldn't even drink lemon, lime and bitters because there's alcohol in the bitters. I was hard line. I decided I wasn't going to drink again. I was never going to take any drugs because I didn't want to be in a position again where I wasn't in control of what I was doing and saying, because it was so frightening.
We kind of live in a modern culture where it's common for people to say, I love you a lot in families and hug each other. It's actually not that common, really, in the world as a whole. And so this is often an issue with migrant families. Once you got better, tell me how you tried to prod your dad.
So Dad and I have had, an interesting relationship. But at the time I said to him, well, I thought, Dad has never told me he loves me. But then I've never really told him that either. And so I said to Dad, I love you. I didn't hear anything back, so I thought, I'll say it again. I love you, Dad. Still nothing. I love you. And then he turns around and says, Mawunyo, I love you too. And that was the first time I'd heard my father tell me that he loves me. But there are so many ways he's shown it. But just hearing those words meant everything to me.
Did you not believe it until he said it?
There was a period when I was younger where I honestly didn't think that he loved me. And there was a situation where a vacuum cleaner salesman came to the house and he had sat us all down, did his demonstration, and he turned to my father and said, do you love your family? And I'm there thinking, oh, my goodness, how embarrassing. He's going to say no. Oh, my goodness. Why did he have to ask him that question? And Dad said, yes. I'm thinking, what? Really? Oh, he's just saying that so he doesn't look bad in front of the salesman. Those were my actual thoughts. But, of course, he loves me. He always has. And I've actually dedicated the book to him because he's such a reader. He reads a lot. And, I love him dearly, and he absolutely 100% loves me.
So after this awful ordeal, you did graduate in journalism. Tell me about your mum's brilliant strategy, Mawunyo, to get you a job on TV with a TV network and how it worked.
Mum is great. I mean, she's an amazing human being, and we were visiting my brother in Sydney at the time. We had our suitcases and everything with us, and Mum all of a sudden says, you've just finished uni, you need a job. And I said, yeah, I do. I was kind of feeling really laid back and cash that day. And she said, well, let's go get you a job. I'm like, yeah, okay. She said, let's go to every television station in Sydney until you have a job. I'm
What,
like,
just front up at the
yeah,
station?
yeah.
Right.
And I said, yeah, okay. She said, where do you want to go first? I said, well, I've, thinking of my situation with Channel 9 earlier and Turner Sports. I thought, well, I've always wanted to work for Channel 9 or Channel 7, And my brother's girlfriend at the time said, oh, Channel 9's at Willoughby. This was when they were at Willoughby. And this was when Channel 7 was at. It was at Epping.
Yeah, that's right.
It was, Mobbs Lane in Epping. And so she mentioned that the ABC was just up the road at Ultimo. And so Mum said, oh, how about we go there first? I'm like, yeah, okay. So we walked in with our suitcases, and walked up to the front desk, and there was a security guy there and a security woman as well. And the security guy said, what do you want? I said, a job. I did not expect the blast that followed. He said, why don't you get a newspaper, circle a job ad and apply for one the way a normal person would? And I was just thinking, oh, okay. But then the woman that was there, the woman security guard, got on the phone and called the head of news. He came downstairs. He saw me there with my mother and our suitcases, but didn't really say anything about how odd that situation was.
Yeah, particularly because the ABC in Ultimo was closer to Central than Willoughby. That's the reason why you're in.
But
not
I didn't
some
tell him
burning
that.
commitment to public broadcast.
But anyway, so this was when there was a proper cafeteria. So we went into the cafeteria. He said, I'm actually looking for 2 people at the moment. He didn't employ my mum, just me. But when can you start? He had a look at my resume, thought it was great, and I got a job there that day.
You went back to Ghana at one point. You were born there, weren't you, initially?
I was, yeah.
And you wouldn't have remembered a thing about it. So going back to Ghana as an adult, was it strange for you?
It was amazing. I mean, Ghana is an amazing country, such an amazing country.
It's an African success story. It's democratic. It's prosperous. It's all these things, yeah.
It is indeed. But I also visited the slave castles there when I went back with my mother. And so this is where they kept captives before they were transported to the Americas and the UK and the Caribbean back in the days of slavery.
These were effectively slave dungeons, weren't they?
Yeah, they were kept in dungeons. And so they're tourist spots now. They take people through there from all around the world. You go in and you have a tour guide telling you what these people went through. And, it's really, really emotional, these tours. And you get to walk through the door of no return, except you can come back through the door of no return, unlike the people who were held in these dungeons. And so...
And what's it like to walk back through the door of no return, if you like, to escape the door of no return?
I just can't describe it. I mean, it is just such an experience. I mean, I would encourage anyone to get to Ghana and actually do these tours, because you just walk away thinking, wow, humanity has a lot to answer for. But then although we've come a long way, I mean, there is still a very long way to go in a lot of respects when it comes to a lot of things, really.
Reading your book in many ways, it's a kind of classic migrant story, an Australian migrant story. The family migrates, the kids have got to sort of explain the new country to their parents. They become overachievers like you. You're an absolute overachiever. And you're subject to all those kind of pulls and tensions and stresses and all those sort of things. And all the time you say, even in Ghana, you felt like an outsider. You never felt quite like an insider in African-American culture in the United States. And, you kind of felt like a bit like an outsider, but then were made to feel like an outsider in country New South Wales. The only culture worth a damn in this world is made by outsiders. You know that, don't you? I don't know. How do you see all that now? Have you come to a place in your mind with all that where you can be content with all that?
Yeah, I have a really strong sense of identity now. So I've researched my country. I understand more than what I did as a teenager, certainly. And I love where I've come from. I love where I'm going. I love where I'm at. And I've just learnt to really sit in the moment and appreciate what I've got and who I am, because it's taken a lot of resilience to get to the point where I'm at the moment. But in terms of identity and knowing yourself, it is so amazing to actually reflect on who you are and realise that, you're not a bad person.
No, you're not a bad person. That's the thing. When you're young, you get put under a lot of pressure to choose one thing or another. You've got to be this. And if you're in doing that, you've got to resign this over here, and you can't be all these things. But you don't have to do that at all. You don't have to choose one thing over another, do you?
No, that's like choosing hip-hop over hymns.
Yes.
Why would you do that? When you can have them both.
Well, you can have it all together now. Is Muswellbrook now ready to claim you and your family? You're one of the town's high achievers now, aren't you?
Yes, there are a lot of high achievers coming out of Muswellbrook, but I feel like I'm definitely one of them. And I feel like that's when people ask me where home is, that's home to me. That's where I grew up. Those were my formative years. Muswellbrook is home. Ghana is also home. Australia is home. That's me, 100%.
It's been amazing speaking with you, Mawunyo. Thank you so much. I've so enjoyed our conversation today.
It's been such a pleasure, Richard.
Mawunyo Gbogbo's book is called Hip Hop and Hymns. I'm Richard Fidler. Thanks for listening.
Subscribe to listen to more free podcasts or download the ABC Listen app and stream ad-free.